All right, hello world. This is CS50 on Twitch. My name is Colton Ogden, and I'm joined today by Brian and David for a part 2 code review stream.
Yeah, indeed. It was a lot of fun the first time, and now we brought Brian, one of our best teaching fellows here on campus.
Good to be here.
Yeah, it was an awesome time last time. We had a ton of viewership, and it's super interesting getting the chance to see everybody's projects. A wide range of programming languages. Last time I looked at some Python programming languages, or programming projects. And I think we looked at a HTML page, actually. We found out that Nate was 10 years old.
Indeed. There's a broad audience out there. So it's good to see some familiar names and faces and emojis here. And welcome to Nabil, who just followed as well. Welcome
and we had another follower, actually. We're adjusting our view here a little bit in real time so that we can actually see not only the comments nice and wide, but also our followers here. So Saeed055 as well, thank you very much for the follow. Licha2G and ndef. Oh, and we have a few, actually. And Seamus Sweet and Hugh, thank you very much for the follows.
We really should just say hello to people's ID numbers, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. It might be a little easier to pronounce, yeah. But yeah, so we have a bunch of awesome projects today, and also thanks to Brian for joining us for the first time.
Absolutely.
And potentially many more going forward. Why don't we dive right into our first project here? I'll do a little bit of
So if you're new to the stream, we via Colton solicited some code that folks had worked on either for personal projects or otherwise via Google form a few weeks ago, and we got a number of submissions in Python, HTML, C, and other languages. And so what Brian and I thought we would do today with Colton here is just provide some feedback, much like our teaching fellows here on campus would, based on the design, the efficiency, the quality of the code that we're seeing, and certainly take all this with a grain of salt. Reasonable people will disagree, so you don't need to take our thoughts as canon, but hopefully it's helpful food for thought, whether it's your code we're looking at or code that's of interest.
Some of us might even disagree.
We shall see.
Probably not. We had a bunch of regulars in the chat. Whipstreak, Nate, who we just actually mentioned, who submitted a thing last week and actually is saying that they submitted more code and they hope that it gets reviewed again. Well, thank you. And we should probably preface this by plugging the actual URL for the form for people that want to submit us projects in the future for more episodes. After this one, this is part 2. We did another one. You can watch the video on YouTube. If you go to bit.ly/CS50 Twitch code review, you can submit a GitHub or a Google form with your GitHub repo or a gist, and then it can be in any language, can be a small project, can be an advanced project, but we'd be happy to take a look at it and grade it on on design and style, not correctness. We will not be bug testing.
I think we need a URL shortener for our URL shortener.
Yeah, we probably should. Yeah, we'll probably convert it to a cs50.ly. But what we have here as the first project, and we've sort of looked at these a little bit in advance and at least sort of curated them in kind of an order. This is a C library, actually, which is kind of cool because we didn't actually look at any C code in the last video, but CS50 teaches C as sort of the first language. It on-ramps everybody to the more dynamic languages. So it's kind of cool to maybe look at a real-world project in C.
Yeah, and it looks like we have a project here from Noah, 11012, libpixmap. And per the top of this at GitHub, you're able to put a description for every project you put on GitHub. This is a simple-to-use library to read and write PPM, or portable pixmap images. Frankly, I was not familiar too much with PPM just a few minutes ago.
Right, yeah, same.
Nor was someone else.
I was not either, no.
But I think that's okay. So let's actually go ahead and Google, for instance, and Wikipedia is probably a great source of information here. And indeed, there's our file format, but in a different number of contexts here. Let's see, pages per minute. It's probably this portable pixmap format. So a netpbm format is any graphics format used and defined by the netpbm project. This is the... These are image file formats designed to be easily exchanged between platforms, and they are with us since like the 1980s, it seems.
Yeah, it looks like in the 1980s they were first developed in order to make it easier to transmit images via emails, where you wanted to be able to send an email that had an image in it. And it looks like this format, the netpbm format, would allow you to take an image and turn it into plain ASCII text, according to this article, in order to just send it more easily from one person to another over the internet.
So Noah, if you're tuning in or if you tune in after, certainly let us know why or what motivated this project, because it's quite interesting, it seems. But as we did last time, shall we just dive right into the GitHub repo?
Yeah, and I should also mention that their GitHub username is actually different from their Twitch username, which we did solicit so that we can shout out them on Twitch. Every release is the Twitch
All right,
user.
keep an eye out for every release, either today or in some future stream. So the way I always start by diving into a student's code or a colleague's code is just to look at like the README. And I think if we scroll down here on GitHub, we'll indeed see a README from Noah. So here we have a nice description. Frankly, we should have just scrolled before, I guess. What is libpixmap? It's a library written in pure C that aims to provide an easy and convenient API for reading and writing PPM files. 4 features: opening PPM images, creating blank PPM images, setting and retrieving the color values per specific pixels, not unlike what we do in CS50, and set and get all pixels. So this actually sounds reminiscent of what we do with bitmap files, which is another relatively simple image format.
What I like is that this library is very simple but very flexible. Like you could use this to dynamically generate any image data based, at least what I'm reading here, by the fact that you can create a blank image and then set and retrieve color values.
Yeah, that's great. It's a good way to start. Because other formats that are more recent, like JPEG, are actually very highly optimized for compression and use much fancier algorithms to store the information, and it's not quite as easy, therefore, to get at individual pixel values.
Yeah.
All right, so should we take a look at an example, for instance, and get a sense of how this all works? Do you want to walk us through what you're seeing here and how you would go about reading someone's code for the first time?
Yeah, sure. So we have the main function there. So it seems like, well, up at the top before the main function, they're including standard.io.h, which you might be familiar with if you've taken CS50. We use that in a lot of C programs. And then they're including pixmap.h, which looks like it's probably the header file for the library that Noah has created here. And that's going to give them access to some of the types that we're going to see in just a moment, probably, and some of the functions meanwhile. So inside the main function, we're defining something of type pixmapImage, so not an image that's built into C, so this probably has some sort of definition that we'll take a look at in just a moment. And we're defining a pointer to it called image. And then we're running a function that looks like he's defined called pixmapImageOpen. I presume this is going to be some file path to the image that we're going to try and open, and we're going to store some sort of data about it inside of what's pointed to by the pointer image. And looks like there's some error checking here, checking to make sure that we're able to open the image successfully. If we weren't able to open the image successfully, we print an error, return a non-zero error code.
And what would it mean for image to be not image? Like, what is this checking for in C?
Yeah, so in C, when you have a pointer value like image and you have exclamation point image or bang image, that's checking to see whether or not image is equal to null. And so null stands for the null pointer, meaning image is not pointing to anything. And so it's a convention in a lot of functions if we try and run pixmapImageOpen, for instance. If we couldn't open the image, for instance, if the file didn't exist at the particular file path, then what we might get back is, rather than a pointer to an actual pixmap image, we might get a pointer that's just null. And so if bang image is checking to see if image is null, in which case something went wrong and we print that error.
So it's really like checking for 0, really, or false. So if not false, then go ahead and do this.
Yeah.
So I'm a little nervous, and we wouldn't know really until we dive into the code, but because image is declared as a pointer, as per this asterisk right here, a pointer to a pixmap image, I'm a little nervous that we're then in this sample code getting the address of the pointer. Unless this image is actually going to do a lot of our memory allocation for us and then change change the contents of that pointer itself as opposed to what it's pointing at, but we'll see.
Yeah, that's a good point.
This is a pointer to a pointer, which feels a little worrisome, but maybe it's correct. We'll see.
Yeah.
All right, and then down here, do you want to try to infer what's going on a little further with these prints?
Okay, so next it looks like we're trying to print the image's width and height, and in order to do that, it looks like Noah's defined some functions, pixmapImageGetWidth and pixmapImageGetHeight, each of which is taking that pointer, a pointer to a pixmap image, and presumably those functions are able to take that image and somehow where inside the data stored within the image get access to the width and the height of that image.
And maybe a couple points here. If you've been taking CS50, you might know that in recent years we actually introduced students to %i for integer. Well, %d for decimal integer is almost identical, and it is in fact with the context of printf. It's a little different if you're using scanf for actually getting user input, but that's otherwise the same thing as %i. And I think it's worth noting for those of you who have heard about or are familiar with object-oriented programming, this is a convention in C that frankly starts to get messy pretty quickly. In C, there is no notion of object orientation, and so even though image kind of sounds like an object, it represents an actual image, and you'd like to just like look inside of it for its width or its height. You could do that if it's a struct, but if there's more to it, you sometimes need to pass these structures into other functions and let them figure out what the height or the width is. So this is a common procedural paradigm.
Yeah, I've seen this in certain like game code bases too. In C, they have to essentially do the exact same thing.
You got to pass everything around as inputs. All right, so just a few more lines here. Let's see if we can glean what's going on here, maybe.
All right, so it looks like we're defining a variable of a new type. We saw the type pixmapimage before, and now we have pixmapRGB, which is probably red, green, blue, standing in place for a single pixel that has a bunch of color values. And now we've got this function pixmapimage_getPixel. It looks like it takes 4 arguments. One is the image that we're trying to get the pixel from, and then we have 2 numbers, and I'm assuming those are like an x and y coordinate of where in the image we want to try and extract a pixel from. And then the remaining is, OK, we've gotten the pixel from the image, and now we probably need to tell the function where do you want to store the resulting information about the pixel. And so we're passing in a pointer to that pixmapRGB variable that we just defined a couple lines earlier.
Nice. And nice and cleanly, it looks like also if we do happen to accidentally pass in 1,000 images, say 500 pixels wide, it does return -1. So there is some error checking that we can cleanly do with the library that's been documented.
That's true. We're not actually using the return value in this example, but you could imagine you might want to add some error checking here where you set it equal to an int and then check to see if that result is -1, because that would mean that the coordinates supplied are not in the bounds of the image. And based on the next 3 lines, it looks like pixel is probably a struct of some kind, because we're using this dot notation to say pixel has a whole bunch of properties within it, a red, green, and blue property. And the dot notation in C is how you access a member of a struct and get access to just the red value of the pixel, the green value of the pixel, and the blue value of the pixel. It looks like those are integers, because we're printing them out using %d. And then we're creating a new pixel, again, creating a new pixmapRGB. And this time, rather than reading it from the image, we know it's a struct. We know it has members called red, green, and blue. So we could also create a pixel just by defining what we want the red, green, and blue values to be for ourselves. We want to decide what we want the pixel's color to be. So this has a red value of 50, green of 150, blue of 200, which is probably going to be a greenish blue color, I would guess. And then looks like we're setting the pixel. We're calling a function called pixmapImageSetPixel. Which follows a similar format to getPixel, but it looks like instead we're going to be providing the image and the coordinates, and rather than reading a pixel from those coordinates, we're taking a pixel of our own, namely new pixel, and saying we would like to update the image most likely and set the pixel at coordinate 100, 100 to be this new pixel that we've just created.
And again, I like the fact that you can just do this dynamically and generate textures this way, because this has applications in game development if you want to randomly generate textures for stuff.
Interesting.
That's pretty cool.
To just change the colors pseudo-randomly, as opposed to hard-coding it, though.
Yeah, exactly. If you wanted to make Mario, for example, have a red outfit, you could do that by, there are ways to do it in hardware in the olden days, but now, generally, you just have a 2D image that's Mario. You can just choose, you can either choose a layer on top of Mario or just recolor Mario's sprite, but this way you could actually hand set however you wanted it, or just make him a new costume from scratch using algorithms.
Well, you know, it's worth noting here, and I'm just inferring this from how this function is being used, the fact that new pixel is being passed in by pointer, or by reference, so to speak, is actually an interesting technique, because strictly speaking, I'm going to guess that when you set a pixel's color to be whatever this pixel represents at location 100, 100, strictly speaking, you don't intend to change anything inside this pixel. You're just passing it in for its red, its green, and its blue value. But the interesting thing is, if each of these values, red, green, and blue, is each using like an integer to store it, that might be 32 bits plus 32 bits plus 32 bits, so 3 times the number, 3 ints in total. Well, you can actually get away by passing in and therefore copying fewer bits by just passing in that entire new pixel with those 3 fields and anything else that's tucked inside of the struct by just 1 int, which is going to be its address. So this is a common technique in C for efficiency. You can pass in a very large data structure to another function as input, but you do it by way of a single value, its address, so as to not waste time copying an entire structure.
I can imagine the same thing applies to like pixmapImageGetWidth too, because image is a pointer in this case, so it will be the same exact thing.
Now you want to be careful. There are techniques that we kind of sort of show in CS50 where you can declare variables or parameters to functions as being const or constant, because the danger in passing in something as an address like this is that means the function you're calling theoretically could change the contents, so you try to at least put a barrier of defense between you and some accidental code.
Was the const thing a fairly recent C thing, or has it been with C since like the 70s?
I'm pretty sure that's been there since
pretty
the
old,
beginning.
yeah.
Okay.
Indeed. And then I can plug this one off. I'm guessing here this is what's freeing the image and freeing up any memory that was dynamically allocated by the original function that actually created this image in the first place.
Nice.
So should we dive into the library itself and see if we can't provide some helpful feedback?
Twin
let's take a
Tower
look.
Power, as quoting me as saying in the olden days, I'm guessing sort of tongue-in-cheek.
Yes, when I was a kid. But all right, so let's see. So when you are looking at a repo for the first time, you've read a high-level English description of it. Where do your eyes go to figure out what's going on with the code itself?
Well, it looks like there's a folder called SRC, which usually just stands for source, as in the source code of this particular project.
Okay.
So it's most likely that the code for the library is inside of that directory.
And notice Noah's been good here. 8 days ago, did he add an extra comment for clarification? That's his GitHub commit. So
Great.
Right around the time we started our sort of
soliciting the yeah. So it looks like there's a test image here. So that'll be interesting to pass in as input if you're playing with the code itself. Which of these would you start with, pixmap.h or pixmap.c?
Yeah, so this is a library that has both the header file, pixmap.h, which is probably going to just declare what the functions and maybe the types are for this pixmap library, but it's not actually going to give us the code yet for how it is that those functions are implemented, most likely. And so it probably makes sense to start by taking a look at pixmap.h, I'd say, just see sort of what's inside of this library, and then we can take a look at the implementation and see how it actually goes about achieving those things.
Yeah, I like that idea. I mean, we talk in CS50 about the idea of abstraction, which is kind of what a header file is. It really just simplifies the contents of something, and then you would go into the C file for the so-called implementation details. All right, so here is a whole bunch of code. Let's just I like to kind of skim everything to get a sense of how much work I have ahead of myself. But it doesn't look like all that much. It looks like it's mostly type definitions as well as function declarations here. So I think we're okay. It looks like we have some familiar libraries up here. Now this is really nitpicky, but I tend to be a little obsessive when it comes to even the simplest of details in code. Like I would actually alphabetize this. It's not a big deal when you have just a few lines here, but personally, whenever I see a list of things, whether it's includes or an unordered list of anything, it's just convenient to know that, well, if ctype.h or something else that starts with a C is in this list, it's toward the top and not toward the bottom. Otherwise, you're using, so to speak, big O of N to search your own code or someone else's code. So super minor point, but I do think it's a useful heuristic in the absence of other rules of thumb.
agreed.
So up here, it looks like here we're declaring an actual structure called pixmapimage that's going to be of type this struct here. And now struct pixmapimage, where is that probably coming from, do we think? Struct pixmapimage.
It doesn't. It would have to be defined above. That's interesting.
I'm not sure where that's coming from.
Is it coming from one of the header files by chance?
Those look like standard library header
Yeah,
files.
actually.
Struct pixmapimage. So the reason we're struggling here is normally this is a data type that we seem to be using. It's called struct pixmapimage, but we're not seeing it actually used. So you know what? If we go back for a moment and go, well, that's the only file. So let's go into the C file real quick. Little digression.
Oh, there it is.
Oh, okay, I see.
Interesting. So pixmap.h. So that is interesting, and I'm not sure that would compile as is. Things are out of order, no?
I'd have to look. I know that I think you can do weird stuff like that.
Can you type type before the structure is defined? I didn't think you could, but maybe you can.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Whoops. Let me go ahead and open both of these up. So here's my C file, and here is my header file. Let's clean this up a little bit. So the reason we're struggling, just to be clear, is that we're seeing used, we're declaring, I mean, maybe. This might actually be valid insofar as it's just declaring a mapping, an alias of this to this string, even though the string is not actually present yet. So maybe that is actually...
Maybe. I didn't know you could do that.
It's like maybe it functions like prototypes in that sense, where you can declare the function signature prior to actually defining the function.
But it's this symbol that doesn't exist. So we don't really have a good... you know what? Can we try this real quick? We actually have technology via which we can answer this question.
Oh, I love the fact, yeah, yeah, that's cool.
So what a nice tool this is. All right, let's see. Oh, we're logged in as Ogden, so that's our coltonoscopy here. So that's who's going to own this. So the reason we're struggling is we're actually both curious, like, is this possible? And frankly, in a class, I might normally say, for time's sake, you know, well, I'll try this later on and get back to you. But why don't we just do it now? If you have a compiler available to you, we can simply test this out. So I've gone ahead and opened up sandbox.cs50.io. I'm going to go ahead and create a file called test.c, for instance. And now my go-to program anytime I'm doing something in C is like, oh, give me an include standard IO and then an int main void and then do something like printf, but we'll just come back to that. But I think the gist of what I'm trying to do here is I just want to declare a type of my own, and let's just declare something like an int to be called David's type. And this would be a, oh, that's not going to work. That's actually fine.
That's fine. Now what we want to do is we want to type def a struct before we define the struct. So let's define a struct for like a coordinate point or something, like type def struct point and just type def it to point, which is the equivalent of what Noah's doing. And then down below, define struct point and say a struct point has an int x and an int y, for instance.
Int x, int y.
So if you're unfamiliar, type defing something is just a way of taking one type and giving it another name to it. And so that makes it easy to refer to something usually by a simpler name. So if you've gone through CS50, one thing that we typed def, for instance, in the CS50 library is char star, which in the initial weeks of the class, just to simplify things, we typed def to string so that you can use a string, and that literally gets interpreted by the compiler as just a char star. But the type defing just creates a mapping between two names, so you can use the latter one instead of the former one.
All right, so we'll see. If this compiles successfully, then I think we have our answer, and that it is OK so long as the struct is eventually defined somewhere else. I'm going to go ahead and do make test, enter.
Oh, apparently it works.
We both learned something today.
Nice.
Very nice. All right, so thanks for that digression. Here we go. So
also, check out the CS50 sandbox.
Yes, good plug for the CS50 sandbox. Notice how we slipped that in there. OK, so let's come back to where we were. So this is declare. OK, so even so, I'm going to still find fault here. So it should not have been that ambiguous to us whether or not that's possible. Can I dare say that declaring something, well, do I want to say this? I'm really uncomfortable with this because I'm declaring in my header file an alias for pixmapimage to be of type struct pixmapimage, but that data type is defined in my C file.
Right.
And frankly, if I want to reuse this data type, and if I have a header file at all, frankly, I really want it to be part of the header file because I want to make sure that this header file works independent even of my C code when it comes to my types and declarations.
Yeah. Right, if pixmapimage has members, then we want to make sure if you're including this header file that you know what the members of a pixmapimage are, which is what they do successfully with pixmap RGB. Tell us in the header file that the RGB pixel has a red and a green and a blue component to them.
Exactly. So what I would probably do here is something like this. Take that same code that we have, go up to my text editor, I'll use the same file for now, and you can go ahead and type def it all in one fell swoop. We can go ahead and say, oops, we can go ahead and say, no we can't. Okay, apparently insert mode is a thing on this computer.
Oh yeah, welcome to Windows.
Type def struct, lost a character there. And then if I'm remembering my syntax correctly, we don't have anything nested inside. We actually don't need that, strictly speaking. Pretty sure we can do this.
That looks right, yeah.
So now we have both declared the structure as well as typed it, and we actually haven't introduced the symbol struct pixmapimage because we've immediately typed def an otherwise anonymous structure here. So that would get the job done, and you could put this then in your actual header file. All right, so let's go back to our header file indeed and see what more we have. So here, same idea, type def struct pixmap RGB, but here too, if you want to declare a type, you can notice you don't have to call it struct something. You can just give it a name at the very end, just as we did as well. Stylistically, this is perfectly fine. In CS50, we tend to put the symbol's name on the next line, but I think that's OK here. What would you glean is going on with lines 17 through 20 here?
Yeah, so 17 through 20 are a couple more type defs, just giving a new name to some of the existing types. And these existing types, I believe they're introduced in the standard int.h header file. And they're just different data types for representing specific types of integers. So namely, we have int32 underscore t. The underscore t just means it's a type. And the type is going to be a 32-bit integer. Where a 32-bit integer is most of our systems by default now, if you're using like CS50 IDE or CS50 Sandbox and you just say int, it will be a 32-bit integer. But that's not necessarily the case. There are older machines on which ints might be 16 bits, for instance, though they're not very common anymore. And so this is just a way of being absolutely sure, telling the system that rather than just use your default value of int, which might be int32, to definitely use a 32-bit integer, which is important if you're doing something like reading and writing images, because you really care about there being a certain number of pixels in a certain place, because the specification for what the image file format means probably prescribes the number of bits that certain values need to be, like the RG and B values.
Now, given that these types already exist, int32t, uint8 underscore t, and so forth, Are you convinced that we should be bothering to declare these synonyms, I32, U8?
I've seen it done before. I personally don't think it's too necessary, that it's not all that much more work to just say int32_t. But if you're using it a lot, I can see why they're doing it for the sake of just being able to use fewer characters to say I32 to stand in for a 32-bit integer.
It's pretty popular in more so like microcontroller, embedded programming, things like that. Like game development in C for embedded systems tends to use this a lot because you do see this a lot because it's architecture specific for the most part for those use cases.
And now what about the style here? I see all of these functions are very nicely aligned such that the return types and the functions names all fall on the same vertical axis, and even the Noah has very cleanly put the pointer, the asterisk, to the left of that very nicely left aligned, although
the last two.
At the end, we got to ding you, -1 here. It's not quite aligned. But what do you think about this? And then all of the argument lists are lined up on the left here too.
Actually, I think it's pretty clean. I'm inclined to, ignoring the last 2 lines, I'm inclined to say this is pretty good. It lets you very clearly see here are the names of the functions and here are the arguments, and it tells me that almost all of them take a pointer to a pixmap image as their first argument, although a couple of them seem to take a pointer to a pointer. So I think that's very readable.
Okay. I would say there's definitely an opportunity for some comments here. I mean,
sure,
insofar as header files are meant to be used by other people using your library, that's where I'm going to go for my documentation ideally. So just prefixing one or more of these blocks of functions with actual comments, just with a description of what's going on, I think would help. I do like how Noah has clustered together seemingly related functions. These are about getting values from the image. This is about creating new stuff. This is about setting or getting pixels. So I think the layout here is nice, but it would benefit from just telling me how these things are used so I don't have to infer absolutely everything.
Yeah, they used really great function names. I think they did an awesome job there, and the style looks great. Self-documenting, but I agree. I think having doc strings or at least some kind of comment system here would really take it to the next level.
Yeah, I agree. All right, shall we take a look at the C file then?
Let's take a look.
What we got. All right, so in the C file, Noah seems to be including pixmap.h, and that's a common convention too. So anything you want to expose publicly to users of your API, go in the header file. Everything else stays internal to this file. So I think we've already discussed how this really should probably go in the header file, and it doesn't even need this name. You can just type def it immediately. And then let's scroll down here. Parses a number from a file, so I'm just reading some comments here. You know, I feel like now we really do need some comments because I'm just starting to see code. I'm seeing prototypes of functions that presumably come later. I think now I'd like to get a little more organization in the file as to what I should be looking at and why. In fact, I don't see any comments actually within the code itself. And what's the price to be paid? I mean, if someone like me is reading the code, trying to find a bug, trying to add a feature, I literally have to read every line of code, think back to how this is working, what is it doing, when you could just tell me that, because Noah or whoever's written the code knows it best, and just save your readers time by just giving them the gist of what everything's doing.
Agreed. I think it's reasonably common to, unfortunately, that I think folks do. I think Noah did an awesome job of writing very clean code, choosing very great identifier names. But I think no matter how good your identifier names, and I think it was even Andre who said this before, we don't necessarily know the why or that. We might be able to infer the how, but the why I think is important, and I think that necessarily comes across despite how clean your commenting or your symbols are.
And I think a good example of this is this line here. So it's clearly the case that we're allocating some number of unsigned ints of size 8. But height times width, I get, that makes sense to multiply, it gives you the resolution. But the 3, again, if I'm coming into this a little unfamiliar with PPM, I'm not exactly sure why that is. Maybe that's because it's 1 byte for red, 1 for green, 1 for blue. So I can kind of infer, but that's the kind of detail that you just tell your reader what's going on there, I think.
Yeah. And actually, back to the header file, though, Bella Kiers raised an interesting question, which was, what was the #pragma wants directive at the top of the file?
Yeah. Do you know what that one is?
I don't know. I don't recall offhand. So anytime you see something begin with a hashtag in C, that's what we would call a preprocessor directive. So when you compile a C program, it undergoes a number of different steps, of which the very first step before the actual compilation is called preprocessing.
This is interesting. So it's very common if you have a larger program that multiple files might include the same header file insofar as each of them depend on it. So it looks like what we're seeing both for the first time, #pragma once literally is just a hint to the compiler, assuming it supports it, that it should only compile this file once. It should not copy and paste its contents effectively every time you see include pixmap.h, include pixmap.h, and so forth in multiple files.
It's kind of similar to like the hash if ndef.
Indeed. So you might have seen this in some of CS50's files. If I open up the sandbox here, just so we have a little scratch pad, you might see something like, what do we say? If ndef foo, then we say def foo, then you put your code, and then what is it?
I believe it's ndif. I'm not 100%.
See, if def, I actually don't remember our own. Oh, ndif. And so in this way too, it's kind of a hack whereby if foo is not defined.
And I think you need the pound sign in front of it.
Oh yes, of course, thank you. If foo is not defined, go ahead and define it in the second line. Then you have your code and then ndif. Then the next time the same file is included, it will be the case that foo is already defined, so none of those lines get executed again. Hash pragma once is just a nice shorthand way of achieving that exact same result.
Yeah.
All right, back to the C code.
Yep.
Anything that strikes your eyes here?
Yeah, I was looking at that malloc line as well. In fact, can we scroll up and take a look at the definition of the struct pixmapimage? I just wanted to take a closer look and see what's included there. Okay, so it looks like it's including a file pointer to whatever it is that was the file that was opened, and then a pointer to an unsigned integer, an 8-bit unsigned integer for pixels. That's an interesting choice because it seems like we're trying to store like an array of pixels here, where I would interpret this to mean like each individual pixel is an 8-bit unsigned int, but maybe what you really want there is like an array of the red, green, blue values, because we defined a struct for a pixel already,
Yeah,
but we're not using that here.
Probably star components would be more accurate in this case.
Interesting, yeah. And actually, I see Andre has chimed in with a similar answer to what pragma once is, and I think I've been typing too much Python. Let me actually correct myself. It should be hash define, not hash def. I was accidentally defining a Python function there. Okay, other thoughts that jump out at you here?
It's storing a width and a height, and it's also storing a maximum color value, which is interesting because I remember in the header file there was also a function for like get maximum color value, so they're storing that there too.
It's nice that they cache the width and height, so it doesn't have to compute it when you do get width or height. It just stores it and then, saves you a little bit of processing.
Yeah, I mean, you would have to store some count there, either of the pixels or of the size, because C, you can't just say how big are you. You would need to store something around, so I agree. I like that approach. Should we scroll down a little further?
Yeah, sure.
All right, so if we go down to the latter half of the code here, pixmap image free. I mean, now I would start to comment really on error checking too. So strictly speaking, if you're using your library correctly, you're never going to pass in an invalid pointer or like a null pointer. But if you're writing a library, you should assume defensively that other people are, and somehow someone is going to err. And it's a little obnoxious if your library, code that you wrote, crashes because someone else has misused it. The onus is really on you, the library author, to defend your code against accidental or incorrect usage. So I would have some simple checks, not unlike the one Brian pointed out earlier, whereby between line 44 and 45 here, just check and make sure that image is not null. And only if it's not null should you proceed to try to close the image file, free the pixels, and free the image. And even then, I would further make sure that you're checking that image file is not null so that you don't accidentally close a null pointer there. Now, back in the day, years ago, when space was incredibly scarce as well as time was very precious when it came to CPUs, you don't want to do unnecessary checks. And so checking for null all over the place, if you're writing most of the code, strictly speaking, wasn't necessary. But you have cycles to spare these days, and I think it's much better practice to code defensively.
Agreed.
Other thoughts that jump out at you here?
Taking a look at pixmap image open now, and seeing that, okay, it does indeed take a pointer to a pointer. So this is one of the questions that we had earlier in the original example code of, all right, we defined a pointer to a pixmap image, and then we're passing a pointer to it as the argument. And so here would probably be a place where I would, again, like to see some documentation of how it is that this actually works. Because it seems like, okay, if the file path that we pass in is null via line 52 there, that we are taking the pointer to the pixmap image and setting that equal to 0 or null and returning. But that behavior, at least I haven't seen it documented anywhere yet. And whether it was in a comment here or somewhere else might be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, what I presume is happening is that there's going to be memory being allocated in here somehow that's actually storing some value at that pointer.
Right.
Which is why if I keep scrolling and scrolling And scrolling. Okay, these comments. All right, so we appreciate the comments here, but at some point they need to be attached to the actual code, I think. So a little opportunity for cleaning up there.
And also the comment width by itself and height by itself, those are interestingly sort of terse comments.
Indeed. Yeah, I'm kind of.
And there's the allocation on line 114.
Up here. Interesting. Okay. So this is interesting too. Noah seems to be assigning to image really null, which is what's happening here, even though he's not doing it symbolically. Because if image is a pointer to a pointer, then star image itself is a pointer. So you could just write this as null. And frankly, you probably should, at least to make clear to the user that this is not the number 0, but it's indeed a null pointer. The casting happens implicitly to an actual pointer value here, but I think that's one opportunity for minor improvement as well, even though not technically necessary. So there was one thing I was going to point out up here. If I can scroll up and up and up. Where are we? No, I think it's okay. It's similar. Oh, here. I was going to ask, this is an interesting syntax that some folks online might not have seen before. On line 67, you see these curly braces with a 0. Do you want to speak to what that is doing?
Oh, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, this just became a quiz. Okay.
I think the curly brace syntax, is that defining an array that contains only 0 elements? Is that the way of defining an array that has multiple things with the same value?
Elements that are 0.
That are 0,
yeah. Indeed. So this is a fancy way of just clearing out all of the memory in an array by storing the value 0 there again and again and again, as many times as appropriate. You could use calloc to allocate that much memory, or in this case, you could use memset or memclear to achieve the same thing.
Yeah. Wouldn't want to do it by hand with a 10,000 size array, certainly.
No, this is a nice little syntactic trick. Should we scroll down toward the bottom before maybe moving on to the next program?
Sure.
Yeah, let's do that.
Let's see if there's anything juicy down here that we might have missed.
A little bit of logic there.
All right, so yeah, now at this point, I really just want you to tell me what's going on. I mean, we could probably figure this out logically by reasoning through it, but there's enough complexity going on now with the code, especially down here with all the parenthesization. Just tell me what I'm looking at, I think. Don't make me think.
It also looks like there's some repeated calculation here that is something you might want to factor out. It seems, just by taking a guess at it, that where you've got an array of what's called pixels, but each really 3 elements in this pixels array together look like they're combining to form 1 pixel. Yeah. We're storing the red value at the first pixel and the green value at the second pixel and the blue value at the third. So that might not be immediately intuitive, but definitely the calculation of where the red pixel should go is a calculation you can do once, and the green pixel is just 1 offset from that, and the blue pixel is 2 offset from that.
Yeah, exactly. Good point.
It's very pretty, and this is an example of pointer arithmetic, too, for those unfamiliar.
Dauntless3 is asking, what's the difference between the brackets 0 and then just empty brackets?
Ah. I'm going to toss that one to Brian.
I don't actually know. Is the empty bracket syntax valid syntax?
I don't know. Assign C empty curly braces. So this is what I would do if unsure. Well, actually, first I would ask Brian. Then I would ask Colton. And then I would ask Google.
My
so
guess
here we
would
go.
be an undefined contents in the array.
All right. Well, this is C++, but that might be close enough. Default initialization, direct list.
I think this is for classes.
That looks like for classes, yeah.
That's too C++ specific. I did say C.
Yeah, you type array in the chat or in the search.
Array. All right. Array. C++. C++.
I think this one. Oh, C++
also
and C probably have the same behavior.
Yeah. I don't want to take too much time. It might be a C++ only thing. I've not seen it.
I haven't seen it either.
In which case, maybe this one we should kick to afterward. Although C programming course notes. Let me search for 2 curly braces.
Initializing array.
No, but place your initializing data in
the curly braces. Yeah.
Multi-dimensional with a single power such as that.
No, they're just saying you can define an array by using the curly braces and something comma something.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say you can't do that.
If anybody wants to try though, C3 Sandbox.
We do. Let's kick that as an at-home exercise, I think, just so we can move on to the next program now. Perhaps.
Sounds good.
Good question, though.
Could be wrong, so that's just our hunch. But I think the instincts here are right. We don't want to take too much time by trying out every little thing in the sandbox, but when in doubt, if you have a compiler, just try it out. All right.
Cool.
Oh, and here we go. So Puppet 4411. Empty brackets in C++ is default initialization, and bracket 0 bracket is setting it equal to 0. Okay. All right, so should we take up another one?
I'm going to go ahead and switch us to this other screen so we can get us set up on the next
Let's
project.
go to the next one. Tuxman29.
Oh, this is a Lua one, so this would be cool.
Oh, Lua, my
All right.
Strength.
I have never seen any Lua code before in my life, so
It's
this is going
pretty.
to be...
It's like JavaScript and Python had a baby, kind of.
Okay.
So please take to heart any feedback Brian has here on your code, then please. Okay, so here we go. I'm overwhelmed by the files and the file extensions, but when in doubt, start with the README. So this is by Tuxman Open Blackjack, which is a game in Lua, a language that Colton actually uses in his game development class. Maybe you want to share the link of that.
Oh yeah, let's do that.
Course. To be used on OpenOS in the Minecraft mod Open Computers. I see a lot of to-dos up ahead, but a few things are done, and that's fine too.
I looked through the code base and it looked like it was pretty feature complete. So.
Okay, nice. Yeah, I see more dones than to-dos, so I got a little nervous that the to-dos were at the top there. Long-term goals. So I think none of this is helping me with the code, and that's fine. It's more for usage thereof. Should we just try to make our way through the code?
Sure,
let's take a look.
This will be fun.
All right, so let's go up to the top here and see where we might begin. All right, so here's the fun fact. Anyone know what DFstore is? I see these sometimes in repos.
I know that it has something to do with the macOS file system, and I'm not sure if it's an optimization file or if it's something else.
It's stored, if I understand right, I think it stores data about the positions of files in like the Finder window in the file system. So if you've organized your files on the desktop and one file is in the upper right and you've dragged another file to like the middle of your screen, for instance, that information has to be stored somewhere. And I think macOS stores that information in a file called .dfstore, such that when you open up the file, it's not that the file itself knows where it's positioned. There's a special file that tells the Finder where on the screen to position the files.
Cool. Yeah. In short, it's just really annoying metadata that ends up in GitHub repos because it starts with a dot, and unless you use a git ignore file and blacklist it, so why don't we actually start there? It's going to get slurped up by your git adds and git commits. So it looks like Tuxman has blacklisted a whole bunch of files, which is good to keep them out of his Git repo.
Nice clean git ignore file though too.
Very pretty, very pretty. Even though it's not alphabetized, that's okay. But what I'm not seeing is a git ignore is a .dfstore. So for instance, in my own git ignore files, if I can open up a little text editor here again, what I would typically do in my git ignore file, which we'll open up real quick here before moving on to the actual Lua code, is if I create a git ignore file, I actually typically start, apparently we can't do that, I'm going to do it without the dot. What I would typically do is actually ignore everything that starts with a dot, which blacklists all of my dot files, which tend to be private or at least configuration or temporary files, and then I unignore the actual git ignore file, which should indeed begin with a dot, even though my scratchpad here does not have a dot.
And for something like, I think we use like a .yaml file for Travis, so you would do the same thing, just hash dot, yeah, exactly.
Indeed. So you don't have to do it that way. It's a little draconian to just say blacklist everything, but honestly, I would make so many mistakes by accidentally committing my vimrc file and other such things that I just tend to do that myself.
Adamantine was saying that they just finished the Match 3 assignment in the game dev course. That's awesome. That was one of my favorite ones to create. Do you remember that one?
Oh, nice, yeah,
The
for
Match 3
sure.
one.
Of course.
That was a lot of fun. And then Pick9117 saying LOL DFstore should be included in a global git ignore. I kind of agree with that, actually.
Yeah, no, agreed. That I think it's fair that no one really wants to commit that file anywhere.
Yeah.
So, Brian, if you're new to this, I see 4 Lua files here,
Yeah.
Blackjack, Debugger, Helpers, Players. Where would your eyes go first?
My instinct is to start with Blackjack, since this is a Blackjack game, and it looks like Blackjack is probably where the main code logic of the program is going to be, and it looks like players might have some information about the people playing the game, but the main logic for the game is probably in Blackjack.
And it's worth noting, especially since we're doing a lot of reading from the repo, these sentences or phrases that are next to these files don't necessarily describe those files. So even though it's right there and it's a little misleading, those are the most recent commit messages that are related to a file that was modified as part of that commit. So just beware that you shouldn't necessarily be reading these pages left to right in quite the same way. So here we go, blackjack.lua. Let's go ahead and scroll down to the beginning of the code. This Brian, this is, we're going to be here a while, Colton.
Yeah, we're not going to go through, definitely not through the whole thing.
Well, let's see what we can glean from this. And Colton's our resident expert on Lua. So I'm going to guess I'm looking at some variables up at the top here. It looks really clean to me. We have comments, presumably mentioned by --, which is a Lua thing. Require, which is a little reminiscent of Node.js for those familiar. But I like the consistency. I like all of the variables are explicitly declared. We're using double quotes everywhere. Everything is nicely documented. I mean, I think the code starts off great.
Yeah. Just not alphabetized, but that's okay. Oh, is it? Oh, it is.
It is.
Yeah, it is.
I take it back.
But I'm not that ridiculous when it comes to, at least, I might do it logically here, so
Yeah.
that's okay.
The comments, I like the fact that the comments are capitalized this time, like the CS50 style guide, kind of.
Yeah, no, for sure. This was actually very common back in the day to actually have like these line separators. Now, I'm guessing there's not the same number of dashes here as there are here, and that's fine. If the whole goal of the syntax is just to make it clear, here is the main part of my game, then this is fine. But honestly, these kinds of conventions are very annoying to maintain. And back in my day when I learned C, we would actually do /* and then a lot of slashes. Let me go ahead and just have a dummy file that we can type anything we want in here. I would do something like /*, and I would count out like 72 or 80 of these stars, when really none of them functionally matter. And so it's, I think, cleaner. Just give me the minimal amount necessary, and if you really want to be anal, you can go ahead and left align them, but at least you're not creating work for yourself by maintaining these widths.
The former style reminds me of Java, like tremendously, because it's very common in Java.
Oh yeah, super common, super common. Okay, so main loop. What do you like or dislike here?
I like that things are separated out into various different functions. I think that's good. It makes it very clear to see what the game loop is doing, that the game just repeats a certain set of instructions over and over again as a bunch of turns happen one after the other. So that's definitely good.
I see a little inconsistency here, and Colton, do contradict me if need be. Even though these functions are being called with the parentheses and no space before the paren, the function's being defined this way. Is this conventional in Lua, or just a little inconsistent?
I don't think it's conventional, no, because if we look down here on line 34...
Oh yeah, the bet function is defined.
It's just inconsistent.
So again, we're really trying hard to find fault, but hopefully that's the point here, just to point out opportunities for improvement. I mean, honestly, if you're not going to comment these, that's fine, because honestly, the functions are so well named that they pretty much tell me what's going on.
Yeah.
I don't think you need all the white space, because honestly, I now look at this and I'm like, wait a minute, did they finish this function? It looks like you're going to go back and comment it later, and I'm guessing you're not.
It's too unnecessarily bloated, I agree.
Yeah, so let's keep scrolling. Here's an actual function that's being implemented called bet. I like the comments. It is in many languages, it's kind of frowned upon to do these inline comments off to the right. It's a lot nicer, I think, visually just to be able to read left-aligned comments right above the code.
Yeah.
Would you agree with Lua?
I agree. I think, especially given how long a lot of these lines are just on their own because of the strings, having the comments also being off to the right, intermixed with these strings, it makes it a little bit hard to sort of read top to bottom and get the flow right.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's good that they're there, but I don't think it's necessary to do
Much
that.
better than no comments at all, I will say.
For sure, for sure.
One thing that strikes me as a little bit odd is that the bet function is calling the main function a whole bunch of times, even though bet is inside of a loop that's running in the main function.
Interesting.
Is that conventional in Lua? I don't actually know.
So I think he's just recursively calling main.
Right,
because, yeah. So this is just an interesting way, I think, of him trying to use recursion. But it's not a Lua-specific thing. No, we saw this actually last week. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would advocate against this, having these sort of hidden cyclical loops that are happening there. After all, the main part of the game really is the main logic, the brains of the game. And if the game's main program wants you to do things again and again, I would factor that loop out and just put it in the main routine. You want to bet multiple times. You don't want to call the main part of your program multiple times.
Yeah, and I would even maybe say like have a take turn function that you could have in a while true loop or something of that nature, and then break out of whichever sub function you want, so that you're going back into the other. Well, actually, in this case, because there's a sequential set of steps. Yeah, I think it would take a little bit more complicated refactoring than just doing that. But
okay.
Yeah, I agree.
Now we do have a question here. I thought with love, you don't have to define your own game loop at the bottom.
That's correct. So this actually is not a love. This isn't a love program. This is a love mod. It's in Minecraft, there's a mod called Open Computers, which allows you to basically program computers in Minecraft to get these computer blocks. And you can program on those virtual computers using Lua and sort of import it into the game. And that's what this context is. And then in that sense, and I'm not terribly familiar with the API, but from what I can glean reading this code base at least, you do have to sort of bootstrap your own application because they are CLI applications. You're essentially running the Lua interpreter on those virtual computers, and therefore you would have to implement loops, core game loop, and so whatever you would need to do to get a CLI app up and running on an actual computer. And so there's a separate environment than Love, which Love is a 2D game development library, which gives you all of that sort of infrastructure for running a set of functions, the update, the render, and the the input, update, and render functions. That's all maintained for you by Love, but completely separate ecosystem.
Now I do see that Tuxman29 is in the chat here. Curiously, we're reviewing Tuxman20's code, so this is 9 Tuxmans later.
Oh,
but
yeah.
I'm guessing they're one and the same, and 28 other Tuxmen were already taken.
Yeah.
But welcome aboard. I hope we're being a little bit helpful here. I will say what I love about Lua is it's just so darn readable, honestly. It's like C without the unnecessary syntax.
Yeah, it is.
To be honest.
It is, yeah. That's what I like about it a lot.
No semicolons, no unnecessary clutter, so I really like the readability.
The gripes that I do have are, I'm personally not a fan of the end keyword. I would much prefer that the function has a colon like Python, and then it can therefore use significant white space. I would prefer that much better, but I'm also kind of biased because I really like Python. Same thing. They do that same thing with ifs and then with functions. And
Bash does this as well if you've ever done shell scripting in a language called Bash. Keep scrolling. I mean, I like how readable the code is. I will say, if we really want to nitpick, I feel like there's just inconsistent commenting. Like sometimes there's really good, really helpful comments, but then other times I'm just kind of on my own. Like why is the table cloning this as opposed to declaring it in some other way? Like just having a bit of helpful explanation in chunks. Don't leave some blanks because it's just more work for me to do later.
Agreed.
But really good commenting here throughout.
I think this was the main big part of the code that I thought could use some refactoring somehow or other.
And I'm not big.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure, right, just looking at it, how I would do it. It looks like there is a bit of redundancy throughout. So I think making a few sub-functions here would make sense.
Yeah, I mean, even for little things like checking for big Y and little y again and again, that could probably be generalized to a function, just so that you could even support then explicit yes or no or such. But I think everything's really on the right track here. Else if it's funny how every language has its own incarnation of this, right?
Python's
elif, else if, else with an if. Oh my God, it's all over the place.
Some with the space, and actually in Lua, if you do else if with a space, it'll create a separate block.
Okay.
So you'll actually if you do else if with a space and then you do the end on the next one or whatever, it'll actually treat the else and that if as two separate blocks, and so it'll expect another end, and it can be a source of weird.
Oh, interesting. And now in Lua, what's the difference with this syntax? I see user colon hit, but I also see user dot something.
Sure. In this case, this is a field and this is a function, but the colon is actually the way, sort of how Python does object-oriented programming, where you pass in self. In Lua, colon passes an implicit self.
Oh, interesting.
So it's a way to sort of get object-oriented programming in Lua. It's a prototype-based language. It's a little bit weird to get classes up and running. I usually have people use a library, a class library, to take care of all that stuff.
So could you do user dot hit? Or
you could. That would be either a static function if you don't pass in self, or if you pass in self as the first argument, it'll function identically to colon.
So this is syntactic sugar, really.
It is syntactic sugar.
Oh, that's interesting. I've not seen that before.
And what is the hashtag before user.hand?
That's the length operator.
Oh,
so everything in Lua is a table, sort of like it has a universal data structure. You can use it as an array. It's sort of like PHP. How PHP has a common data structure for everything. The Lua has a table, and hash just tells you how many keys are in that table. It can either be array indices or string indices, however.
That's actually pretty brilliant. That's maybe the best use of a convention for length that I think I've seen, instead of .lang or .length or len.
I'm a big fan.
It's like Ruby, but without the crypticness. The number of things in the following symbol. I like that. So if we keep going, I mean, I think my reactions are largely the same. I mean, overall good, maybe just a little opportunity here and there to clean things up. I mean, the file is, to be fair, if we keep scrolling, starting to get pretty big, but we saw there's 3 other files, so I think there already has been some factoring going on, though I love ASCII art, so you already won me over here.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's pretty cool. So this is the main function. So how does this main differ from what we saw earlier, actually? What did we see earlier at the very top?
Oh, let's take a look at that, actually.
Oh, games. Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So how do we
game
think
and main
about
are
the
different.
difference here?
So game would be the top level function. Where's main actually getting called from?
Let's see.
Does main call game?
Main is getting called by game, recall.
Oh, okay, right.
Or by bet, even.
Okay, so main is being called way up at the top where we began our story.
Yeah, main's getting called in bet several times. So
and then
bet I wager. Oh, so bet's actually being called by game, not by main. So I think we had that.
Yeah, bet is in the game loop.
Okay.
So here.
Those
are
and
main is calling
functions.
main too. So. It's
and main is calling game?
Oh my goodness.
Okay, so this is spaghetti code then, a little bit. It's kind of, we have a bunch of tendrils sort of all over the place.
Yeah, it's getting a little scary for my taste, because I mean the fact that we're struggling to understand the logic means like I'm going to be hard pressed to help contribute to this kind of project.
Yeah.
Without really wrapping my mind around things.
Yeah.
Okay, but we do have the main function down here. Oh, it's called, of course, at the very end of the line. Nice. Well, it looks like this is how you could give yourself more initial money, perhaps.
Yeah. Nice.
Should we glance quickly at just the other files just to get a sense of what they are and then move on to one other project or so?
Take a look real quick.
All right, so there was debugger, Lua, maybe players you mentioned. Should we look at that one? See what a player is. So it looks like here's a player class, so to speak.
Yep. This is how you implement a class. And the way that it works is a little bit odd. So every sort of table has a meta table associated with it that has, it's sort of like meta classes in Python, how you can define the behavior for when you set things and when you assign different attributes and whatnot. And so you have to basically set the meta table for an object player in this case, like we do in JavaScript, you set the prototype for something.
Okay.
And then when you call new, you can therefore get a new version of that object with all the same functions and fields.
Interesting. And self you just get for free. Because you're using that syntax.
Yep.
So I will say, I actually like the inline comments here because it keeps all of these properties nice and close together. It's very skimmable if I only care about what's on the left in the actual code. But if I want a quick reference as to what it is, I can look to the right.
Yeah.
So I think I'm okay with this because if you were to put it on top of every line and separate it with new lines, I mean, this thing gets super tall and really doesn't add anything compelling.
Yeah, I think so. I would probably indent them evenly, but I mean, that's a little bit of extra work that may not be necessary.
I would say about the comments specifically, if these are all just properties of the same object, the property values should probably all be like nouns, for instance. Like money is defined as like remaining credits, but choice keeps track of users' choice. And so I think there's just some inconsistency there that makes it a little bit harder to just get at a glance like what it is that each field is doing, especially since there are a fair number of fields.
So yeah, self.choice. Yeah, okay, so that would be, I guess, an enum kind of thing.
Sure, if we were inferring correctly how it's used. So it looks like these are just the various methods that are associated with a player. So not unexpected. Should we take a quick look at the other two files?
Yep.
All right, if we go back here, we had helpers. I like helpers. We'll do debugger last because it might be a little specialized.
Tuxman was saying debugger is not his library, just included.
That's really helpful. Okay.
We might be able to skip that.
Okay, all right. It's going to be awkward if we say, what a good library this debugger file is.
Yeah.
Okay, and looks like this is used for helpers, so just some related helper functions for sleeping, clearing, table cloning. So here there's good comments above every function, which is quite helpful.
Yeah. Some of the most comments I think we've seen so far in a repository.
Yeah, I'd just like to see a little more consistency. I mean, overall, I think we're really nitpicking, but it would be nice now. I mean, now we're sort of in fewer comment territory, and so I'm sort of less happy. I'm doing more work to understand this.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it looks like this is a good way to factor it out. So much like I mentioned earlier, maybe a function to check for yes or no or y or n. Looks like check suites here is a good way of checking for maybe quit or no, it's probably jack, queen, or king in this case here. Although check converts the face card. I see. We're just mapping a number on the card to an actual number, and we're special casing the three things that are not in fact numbers alone.
To Sakuro's point about the main sort of module, they were asking, does Lua not have a while loop? Because that would be better than calling itself at the end of the function. I agree. I think a while-based format for that last module would be a good way to refine it.
Yeah. Nice. All right. And then lastly here, oh, what good commenting. I like this. And it answered a question I had, are there multi-line comments? It would seem in Lua there are if you actually use these additional brackets. So that's kind of nice.
I mean, I do have a question about, so in a language like Python or JavaScript, for instance, if there was a library that you wanted to use that was written by someone else, in Python you might put it in like the requirements.txt file in order to say it's a dependency for this Python library. In like a Node JavaScript project, you might put it in package.json to say it's a dependency for the project, such that if the debugger library or whatever library you're using is ever updated, you can you don't need to then copy paste the updated code into your repository. So it seems like they've Tuxman has copy-pasted the debugger library here into the file. Does Lua have a way of saying, here's the dependency, and I'd just like to make this dependency part of this project without needing to copy the file in?
I think for non-Love 2D stuff, there's a distribution network called Lua Rocks, kind of like Homebrew, kind of like pip. And in that case, I think there's probably a like requirements.something. Let me see here real quick. Lua Rocks dependencies.
Googling off to the side here.
You just see. I don't use it outside of the context of Love 2D too much, so I actually can't say specifically. Dependencies of a rock is like a Lua Rocks project, are specified in its rock spec file.
So that might be the rock spec file might be the equivalent of what like a requirements.txt file is for Python.
Spec for Ruby.
Yeah, I wanted to see if there was a sample of it here, but let me see. Rock spec file.
I'm gonna Google on my side too. So here we have, Brian, the formal definition for a rock spec file, which is the type of file you would put akin to requirements.txt in Python to pull in some dependencies. I think this is the same URL you had a second ago.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the actual file format is.
Yeah, we can probably get a quick sample here.
Creating a rock, is that?
Creating a rock, kind of cool.
Writing a rock spec? All right, this is
Here
what it
might
looks
be
like.
a representative one, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah, so it looks like down at the bottom there we have dependencies where you can specify what packages it is that this particular Lua file depends on. And here it depends on the Lua package, presumably. But I wonder if you could add the debugger as one of those to avoid having to copy it into your own repository.
Yeah.
But that's nice. I mean, if it gets the job done, that's certainly fine. But it's generally frowned upon to just store in your own code repository someone else's code because they're not going to be in sync now. And there are actually more sophisticated mechanisms built into Git. You can use what are called Git submodules, for instance, to make a dependency link to another GitHub repo. But there are also language-specific options as well. And that's what we do in CS50 with, of course, our Python module.
Git submodule is probably a good way to do it because most of the libraries I've ever used are on GitHub for sure with Lua.
So really nice overall. I think maybe just aspire to be a little more consistent with the commenting. We, for time's sake, I think won't dive really deeply into the code because there were so many hundreds of lines.
Yeah.
But really nice overall.
Yeah, great job, Tuxman. It was a nice repo to look at.
Should I flip screens and go ahead and pull up one other project here?
So you were off the network, off the grid right now.
All right. So here we have one from TPDD26, which is a Python Flask app. Let's go ahead and pull that up.
I'd like to shout out our followers.
Yeah, let's catch up on any comments and questions too.
So DSIP and SMI, Stephen5588, Zarklin Denhar, Nafi664, GDF
How'd you read that one the fastest?
Nuclear USA, Janeth George, Pick9117, Big Fupas, 127001, Soshi, Joe 2E18. Is that 2 to the 18th?
Maybe.
2 times 10 to the 18th.
Oh, 2 times 10 to the 18th, right, okay. Ron Laniado, sorry. Windy Mindy, Alicia,
That's good. That's
123,
nice pronounceable.
Matthews NB99.
Nice. Well, welcome aboard to the stream here. Any questions come in on the chat we should pluck off here?
Yeah, let's take a look and just make sure that we didn't miss too much. So this
less
is
main call.
Sakuro's
Okay, good.
thing that. Oh, okay, nice. Less main calls. Yeah.
All right. I think we're up to date.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. Oh, and Ivan Friend, can you review my code? We can go ahead and paste in the Bitly URL again if you'd like to submit your code for a future stream. By all means, Colton had pasted that earlier today.
It was a troll message.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, never mind. All right, so let's take a look at a Python Python repo here. Flask web app for reviewing books. Nice. I see some pretty standard layouts, not unlike what we do for CS50. I see a proc file, which suggests that this is maybe being deployed to Heroku or some service like that. Start with the README as always. Oh, this is nice. This might actually be live. Should we see if we can see the live version, if it's still alive?
I have a feeling this, the first project for CS50's web programming class on edX is a book review application. And by the looks of the files, I'm wondering if this is an implementation of that project.
What a well-designed repository. It looks like the app is not running. Oh, no, it is. Just slowly running. This does look awfully familiar now.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should maybe turn our attention to one that's not course specific, perhaps.
Okay, yeah, sure, let's do that.
All right, well done. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. We just don't want to spoil the project for folks that are still working on that. So we're going to move down, but thank you for the submission. A CS50 final project, that works well. So this is from S4G4R. Let me go ahead and paste this into our window here. And this is a simple web application that helps you keep track of your favorite TV shows and movies.
All right.
I noticed that this student might be abroad, perhaps in the UK, having spelled favorite a little different than we would in the US.
Good observation.
That's my first takeaway so far. Let's scroll down here.
Are we gonna knock them a point or gain them a point for that?
That's amazing. I love different spellings. All right. So this is actually kind of cool. I mean, all the better that we got a screenshot because you don't now have to fire up the whole application just to give yourself a mental model for what's going on. I see Bootstrap, I think.
Yep, looks like a Bootstrap navigation bar up at the top and a Bootstrap table.
Yep, which is nice to make things a lot quicker and easier to look pretty. This is a simple web app that queries the API at the MovieDB, which with the help of TMDB simple wrapper to pull information about movies or TV shows. It looks like you can add, remove TV shows, specify seasons and episodes that you're on. This sounds pretty cool.
Yeah.
All right, so where should we dive in? If we go up to the code here, it's indeed a Python application, and there's a few different files though. how would you propose we begin?
Yeah, well, let's take a look and see what's inside of the app directory, perhaps. It looks like that probably contains the source code for the application.
All right, I see 4 files here.
Forms, models, routes, and search. So I guess this is a web application that probably has some sort of database where they're storing information. Models.py is a conventional name for where all of that data is stored, defining the types of models. I noticed that back over in the original page that the repository was tagged at the top with Flask SQL Alchemy, which is a library you can use to interact with Flask and a SQL database. And so, tv.py, is that?
Might we want to look?
Oh, I didn't even notice that one. All right, let's take a look at that.
I'm just guessing, because it's a TV app. That might be the equivalent of application.py.
And yes, you're correct.
Now this is, while very pretty, very arbitrary, I would say. I have not seen this convention before, but okay. You want to take us through this?
All right, here we are. So we're importing a couple things. We're importing...
Thank you, Brian.
Importing Flask. Config, I saw that there was a config file in the repository, so this looks like some file that they've defined.
So that's cool. You can import from your own files.
Right, you can import from your own modules or from modules that you've installed. So Flask SQL Alchemy is probably inside of the requirements file for this repository.
Nice.
So that's a package you would have to install, but config is probably a module that they've written and installed and just imported into this file.
And this looks like a nice way of just factoring out what could be a large configuration for your app without cluttering your logic. Okay. Down here's some familiar stuff too. And models, we don't talk too much about these in CS50. What might this mean here?
Yeah, so what I was mentioning a moment ago, inside of the app directory, we saw there was a models.py file. And so inside of that file, which we'll probably take a look at in a moment, probably contains, the way that Flask SQL Alchemy likes to do this is by defining a class for each table that you have in your web application. So if maybe this one has a table where they're keeping track of television shows, for instance, so you'd probably have a model or a class, because Python allows for object-oriented programming, that would define like a class for television show, for instance, that included what the properties of a television show are and any methods or functions that you might be able to run on television shows. And it just allows for a nice way to interact with the database via what's called an ORM, or object relational mapping. So this is basically just saying, all right, let's take the application and import all of the database models or the tables that we want to represent in our application there.
Nice. And Login Manager, this is actually a feature of Flask. I think it's a third-party plugin you can use just to make your life easier when it comes to logins. We in CS50's code kind of reinvent this wheel more simply for students. And then it looks like the routes, like app.route, has been factored out to a separate file as well.
Yeah, this is into a blueprint, which is not something we talk about in CS50, but Flask has a feature whereby you can create different blueprints. If your application.py file is getting very long and you have a whole bunch of different routes, you can separate routes into different blueprints and then just include all of those blueprints just to put your routes that are related into their own files, just for cleanliness.
So perhaps without going through every file, should we look maybe at models first and then at the routes?
Sure.
And see where that leads us?
Seems reasonable.
And just to draw attention to this, I mean, this is fine. It clearly is kind of trying to separate different chunks of code in this file. And if it's like a finishing touch on the file just to make it a little more readable, I mean, it actually is. Honestly, it's this kind of stuff, though, that's just annoying to maintain, and I do think it's uncommon to leave that kind of stuff in there long term.
Yeah, I'd probably nix those and keep
It's
the
not
single line
anything.
comments, yeah.
Yeah, indeed. All right, let's take a look at models, which was in the app directory, as Brian noted. There's a few other files in there, but we'll focus on models and I think routes for now. And this is kind of interesting. We don't focus on this in CS50, but you do in the web programming class.
Right,
So what are we looking at here, would you say?
So here we're defining a class for a type of object called user. And long story short, you can use objects of this class to represent rows inside of a table of users. So in CS50, if you did the finance assignment, for instance, you had a table called users where each user had a username and a hash and the amount of money they had. You see a similar thing here where we're defining a class called user, and we're saying for every user or for every row in the user's table, because you can kind of draw this analog between the class and the table, every user has a username, a password hash, whether or not they've been authenticated, which appears to be a Boolean. And so Flask SQL Alchemy lets you specify the types of these columns as well. So we're not using strict SQL syntax here, but we're getting at the same idea, that every column inside the table is going to have a type. So username is a string, which probably corresponds to like a text or a varchar type, depending on the database. Same goes for password hash. Authenticated as a Boolean. And then movies and shows, those are going to be relationships between tables. So it looks like later on in this file, we're going to see a class called movie that's going to represent a movies table, and a class called show that's going to represent a shows table. And the idea here is that a user is associated with one or zero or more movies, and is also associated with 0 or more shows.
Indeed. And this is actually a convention here. What Flask SQL Alchemy is probably doing is assuming that the movie table and the show table has some kind of user ID associated with it in some linking table.
This is actually, Backgraph is going to create the link in the other direction. So this means that if you have a show object, you can say show.user to get what user is associated with this show.
And get the actual user object associated with it. Very nice. So here seem to be some related methods that pretty much do what they say, and this seems very readable. And here I would say, all right, you probably don't really need to comment these because you would just literally be restating the obvious because the functions are so well clearly named. You talked about this recently in a stream, I think. Repper, I think in your last stream.
I think, yeah, we did a stream recently on object-oriented programming.
What's this?
So if you try to print out the value of an object in Python, for instance, as just by typing print and then the name of the object, by default, Python's just going to print out like the memory address where that object happens to be allocated inside of a computer's memory, which is not all that helpful if you're trying to get an understanding for what exactly is this object. And so Python lets you define a special method called __repr__, short for representation, where you can return the string value that you would like to represent the object as when you try to print out an object. And so here we're saying if we want to print out a user object, the information we should print out is, in brackets, user, and then the username.
Yeah. And now if we scroll down further, we see another class definition here for a movie. Pretty self-explanatory. Every movie has an ID, a name, a status, apparently a rating, and a user ID, which is probably the user who created this movie in the database. A couple comments come to mind here. It tends to be conventional, especially for your primary key, just to call the ID and not call it movie_ID, for instance. Both are fine, especially if you're going to use it as a foreign key elsewhere. But insofar as your user table has a field called ID, that should either change also to user_ID, or I would just simplify the movie ID as being ID. And in this context, anytime you see ID, that's the primary key. Anytime you see something _ID, it's a foreign key from another table. And here too, I actually don't recall the syntax offhand, but this feels like we're breaking the abstraction that is the ORM, the object relational mapper that is SQL Alchemy, because he's specifying the name of the table here, even though strictly speaking, we don't know that from the ORM. It just happens to be by convention the lowercase version of the class name. Is there not another way to express foreign key without having to know the table name?
I think that this is actually the conventional way of doing it, I think.
Really?
But there is a way of, if you want to explicitly state what the table name is, if you look at the examples in the web programming class, we in the class define an __, table name __, which is a feature of SQL Alchemy to say, here is what I want the name of this table to be. Otherwise, it just goes to a default. But this, I think, is pretty common. I don't know if there's another way of doing it.
It just rubs me the wrong way.
It is a little bit strange.
You have to know the convention.
Yeah.
I will say here, and I don't recall with SQL Alchemy, does it support enums?
It does, yeah. So I was actually going to make that comment as well, that it seems like the status of the movie, like it says the default is not watched, so presumably there's also a status option called watched, but presumably there's some fixed and finite sequence of possible statuses, whether it's 2 statuses or more. And so SQL and other languages have a special type called enum, which basically means that the value of that column can be one of a number of possible values. In this case, in the sandbox, we've defined an enum that is either watched or not watched. And that just guarantees that the value in that column is only going to be one of those possible values for the enum, and it can't be anything else. If it's just a string, you could run into a potential class of bugs if you accidentally mistype the string, for instance, and you end up setting the status to something that is not one of the types of statuses that you're expecting. And so if there are only a fixed number of possible values, an enum is usually a better design for what to do with that table.
Agreed. And even, it's minor, but just as I did in the sandbox, just using something like all caps and using underscores, just make it a single token. Don't make it an English phrase like this, not watched, I would say would be the convention.
Right.
All right.
Sugar themselves are actually on right now. They say, look, looks like I'm on time. Thank you for reviewing my repo.
Of course, yeah, glad you were able to tune in.
And thank you also for following. They just followed as well.
Awesome. And now we have a show, similar comments. I think show ID could probably be called ID here. Show name is fine, though honestly I would probably just call this name and
Same
this
with movie name.
It just simplifies things a little bit, and it's going to
redundant.
be readable when you do something .name anyway, when you have an object of this type.
Yeah.
Current season, episodes watched. I mean, for the most part, it's hard to find fault with any of this. You could specifically say, let's see, nullable false. I mean, for good measure, you could make these nullable false too. They already have default values, so it sort of is already covered. but this way you can't accidentally get some ambiguous null value in there as well, which is the default. So this is really clean, and if you've not used an RM before, this is actually a great example of a data model that does have some interrelationships that are well served by an RM, so you don't have to write all the manual SQL yourself.
Yeah, I don't know what the intended features of this are, but one thing to note is that, for instance, based on these classes, if two different users were watching the same television show, for instance, and wanted to record it, they would be two just totally separate show objects. You could imagine that if you eventually wanted to have something where you could see like who else is watching the same TV show that you are, that you might want to change the schema slightly in order to allow for that type of thing. But perhaps for the purposes of this application, this is fine.
And I don't know if we'll be able to glean this just by looking, but I'm a little curious what authenticated means here. Generally, authenticated means logged in. But it would be a little weird to store in the database the fact that the user is logged in. That kind of state is usually maintained in the application itself or via cookies. So we'll have to see if that is
Yeah, it also seemed a little bit strange that both the isAuthenticated method and the isAnonymous method are both returning self.authenticated. I wasn't entirely sure what that means, and some comments there would maybe be helpful. But
or a not in there might be helpful. I presume these are supposed to be the opposite of each
it could
other,
be a bug.
maybe. So that could be a bug. How are we pronouncing it? Sugar?
We'll say sugar or S4G4R.
Okay, there we go. Perhaps it's more validated. It could be. So M. Kloppenberg is proposing that maybe that means the users just confirmed their email. Maybe, but I'm not seeing an email unless username is meant to be an email address. So unclear just from the code alone. Should we take a look at the routes?
Yeah, let's look at routes.
All right. So here we have a whole bunch of imports as well related specifically to routes, but notice that there's some linkages among these files. We're importing the models so that we have access to that. App forms is another file that we haven't looked at. And then there's this blueprint feature that Brian referred to earlier. You know, I probably throw a space in there, and all of a sudden I do see single quotes, whereas I think in the other file we were seeing, were we seeing single or double quotes?
This file at least seems to use single quotes. I can't recall what we saw in the other file.
Yeah, not a huge deal, but if we go back here, no, it was single quotes too, so that's fine. Then I have no qualms. Routes.py is where we were. So here we have, it looks like a decorator. This relates to apparently the function you're supposed to implement yourself if you are using Flask's login manager.
Yeah.
So you would know that from the documentation.
And that function is just returning a user. And so if you haven't seen the syntax before on line 17, this is the SQL Alchemy ORM syntax that we've been alluding to. And the syntax user.query.getID is just the ORM way of saying, the object-oriented way of saying the SQL query, like select star from users where ID equals that ID, for example.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, the ORMs are very readable when you're doing simple queries like that, and we'll perhaps see some other uses of that too. Here, this is very nitpicking, but because these definitions of the functions, these doc strings are so short, you can probably pull line 23 up onto line 22 and pull line 24 up onto line 22 too, just to keep this more compact, because you've added 2 extra lines that aren't really adding anything. But the fact that you're consistent, I think, is more important, so no strong feelings there. Technically speaking, you don't need this. It's fine for readability, but that happens to be the default. If you no, is it just get?
Get is the default.
It's just
in order to get and post,
it.
you do need both.
That's right.
Yeah.
So up here we're getting just get, but down here we're getting get and post. Thank you. And here we have if the user is authenticated. So I'm a little worried how this is being used, honestly. Yeah. Current user. All right, we're going to have to see how logins actually work. Login form.
There was a forms.py file elsewhere that's probably defining what the forms are.
The login form, yeah. So let's see. This is where we're validating. Okay, so here's where we're filtering. So this is another use of the ORM, but you're not doing where ID equals something. You're doing where username equals something.
Right, yeah.
So that's nice. And first just gives us back the first row, and hopefully there is only one row, if any. If not user, we're going to flash the user with a message, which is to put like a temporary message on the screen and then redirect them to the login page. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and store the user's password from the submission and get the user's password hash. And we're going to
checking to see if the password is correct when they're logging in.
Okay, so this is the, yeah, I don't like this part, I think.
Yeah, so it's the authenticating the user part where we're storing something in the database when more conventionally this is probably stored in like a session, for instance.
Yeah, because you know what? Let me just scroll up for 1 second if I could. I've not looked at the login manager, but I'm a little nervous that because we're storing the fact that the user is authenticated in the database, that I could... We'll have to look closer at the code. I worry that someone else could pretend to log in as my same username, and because the database already thinks I'm authenticated, Colton or Brian could maybe get in as me. Now, it's possible the code's defending against this, but generally speaking, this is what you would store in a session. So if you were in your Python code to do something like session user, quote unquote, gets something, or you could say authenticated and then just set this equal to true. This way it's user specific and not tied globally to what's in your database.
I will say their commenting is the best I think that we've seen so far.
You know, I just kind of took it for granted.
Yeah, the commenting's good.
Nothing negative to say, so I didn't even think to say something positive, unfortunately.
Yeah, we're focusing on the actual like larger, like higher order, higher level.
This is great. These comments look like they could be written by me. Although, okay, I'm going to quibble. I see a period here, a period here, but no period here. So I'm sorry, disqualified after all. No, but that's actually great commenting so far.
Here is where the methods would have been unnecessary. If it's only the get method, strictly speaking, you don't need it there.
Thank you. Redeemed also here too. Nice. All right. De-authenticate the user. Yeah, so strictly speaking, you don't need to be touching the database for this. This should really be ephemeral data, not needing the database. Registration. Oh.
Also, yeah, even given that line 87, db.session.add user, would generally mean you want to add a new row to the database for this user object, but presumably this user is already in the table. So I wonder, I think that might be a bit of an issue of just adding the user.
Well, I think that line 87 is just going to fail, but maybe it fails silently because the primary keys are going to clash.
Yeah.
But I guess it doesn't throw an exception if this code is indeed working. Here, this is a minor point, but the fact that you have your logout route, but you are requiring that the user be logged in to use this is a little perverse in that if the human goes to something.com/logout, they just want to be logged out. But this code is going to force them to first log in, even if they're not logged in, and then they're going to be logged out. So honestly, you shouldn't need this at all. You should be able to, well, you need this insofar as your code assumes this at the moment. I would probably have a check there as to whether or not this is a valid object or not. With if current user, then do this instead. Scrolling down, looks like registration.
Andrew Reddy is asking, what happens if the actual user logs in and some other person logs in another browser since authenticated is true in the database?
Yeah, that's the threat that David was alluding to before. That depending on how the login manager is implemented, it could be possible because we're storing the authentication information inside.
And let's check. Let me see if I can find the login required. This might come with the library, do we think?
Maybe. It's from Flask login. Yeah, so it's part of the Flask login.
Let's see if we can chase this down, because he might be okay. Flask login required. Let's see if we can just find this and see what it does. I'm going to search for this, login required. If you decorate a view with this, it will ensure that the current user is logged in and authenticated before calling the actual view. And that's what we do want. But how is it done? It looks like it must require that they be implementing, that the programmer be implementing this method?
I don't think that's something the programmer implements. I think current user is an object that Flask login gives you access to. I think if you go to routes.py and go to the imports, I think current user is just something that's given to you by Flask login.
Oh, very interesting. Okay, so is authenticated. Huh. I think I'd have to noodle on this a little bit more, but I think the threat is real. And who asked that? Indra Reddy. I think the fact that we're storing things in the database is what makes that unfortunately problematic, because by storing it in the database, you're making it globally true that the user is authenticated, whereas sessions and in turn cookies would make it locally true for one specific person only.
And at minimum, a problem you definitely run into is if you're logged in two places, on your phone and on your computer, for example, and you log out on your phone, that's going to set authenticated to false, and now suddenly on your computer, it's using the same database, and you're going to be unauthenticated there as well, which could probably not what the user is expecting.
Whoops. Indeed. I mean, honestly, this code at first glance certainly looks terrific overall. This is very clean. It's very well commented, albeit with occasional exceptions. Like for some reason we forgot to comment this. It seems there's this stuff up top, which, strictly speaking, isn't bad. Let's see, update movie. Oh, go ahead.
There's some inconsistency between lines 268 and 285. So 268 is probably the more conventional way of using a movie class and sort of filtering it, doing like a select where you have movie.query.filter by. The line 285 also works, db.session.query movie and then filter by, but it's a little more of a verbose way that's less common with the ORM, and so just consistency there is probably a good thing.
And now I am curious if we can go down one rabbit hole, update movie, whatever this is.
That's a form, most likely. I would expect to
Can we
find that
take
in
that a look?
forms.py.
Okay,
Yeah.
so let's go to forms.py. And it looks like he's using Flask WTF. What the form? Flask form. So if we scroll down to, what was it, user form?
Update movie. Here's update movie. So just defining the fields of a movie. So this is a way of just more easily generating form code, if you're doing a lot of it, of form validation and things like that, as opposed to repeating form validation code over and over again. You can define a class and use the Flask form library to just simplify some of that.
It looks like you actually get validation functions as well. Are those server-side or client-side? Do you know?
I think they're server-side, but I haven't actually used this library all that much.
'Cause some libraries, I'm not too familiar with WTF, can actually generate client-side JavaScript for you so that you're not writing the same kind of logic in two places.
Interesting, the little circle arrow.
Yeah, we got a little Unicode going on over here. Missed opportunity for an emoji, but okay.
Poop emoji.
That's all right.
Like Swift, doesn't Swift let you do that? Dan used to tell me,
Swift, yes. It's several programming languages support, and actually, we can see, I have not tested if the CS50 sandbox does. Let's go ahead and paste this in. How about session authenticated gets happy face? Okay, you could do that. That's actually could be fun. And then you put a sad face when you're not authenticated, and then you get criticized everywhere online for bad codes. Okay. All right. Well, let's see. Do we have any questions we should pluck off? Because I see we're here at 2:30.
No, I don't think so. Whipstreak was asking if we checked his code, but unfortunately
no, we checked your code last week, Whipstreak. So, but coming up again soon, hopefully.
Yeah, we'll take a look at the other repo that you submitted. Yeah, thanks to everybody who came by today. We had a pretty lively chat here. A lot of viewership again, as always. Thanks to Brian for joining us for this code review
happy to be here. Thanks everyone for watching.
This is awesome. But yeah, I would say all together.
All right.
I think
thanks so much for tuning in, and for Brian for joining us. I think we'll keep doing more of these. So should we paste one more time the URL via which folks can submit? So if you'd like to submit your code for review by any of us or any folks on CS50's team here on Twitch, please do so at the URL Colton just pasted, and we're happy to take a look and really just have a conversation about it.
Yeah, if anybody has any last questions too, we'll maybe stick around for a couple minutes and see if anybody has anything, and then tomorrow we're doing Solitaire. That'll be fun.
Just you?
Yeah, just me.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
because of Solitaire.
Solitaire.
Yeah, there we go. Nice. Next session tomorrow. What time Eastern time?
Tomorrow 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Yep.
So it'll be in Lua and Love 2D. We'll be making Solitaire, a very famous sort of solitarily played card game. And it was pretty famous on Windows machines. Windows 95, I think, shipped with it, and then prior
I remember
that. Preceding iterations of Windows also.
Yeah, and Shai asks, do you guys review other languages, technologies? Yes, we are happy to review technologies and languages we are not even familiar with.
Yeah.
So please send any languages your way. Maybe a question for Brian from Indra Reddy. Is CS51 a follow-on course public?
It's not public on edX. It is available through Harvard Extension School during some years, but it's not open courseware the way that CS50 is. If you've taken CS50 and you do want to take other classes, though, CS50 has a number of follow-on courses, including a game development class in Lua, a web application class in Python that you can definitely take a look at, and those are available on edX if you'd like to explore more after taking CS50.
Indeed, you can check out that URL there, which should lead you to all of CS50's courses. VD Hug, the code review is about any project. Can it be a personal website, for example? Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the only thing we do ask is that it not be a CS50 or a course project for CS50's courses, lest we spoil the fun for other students. You can absolutely, Cabby2201, post code from games if you'd like, and thank you, Bora Maps, for the kind remark.
Beautiful young gentleman. I will send over some assembly code tomorrow. That's gonna be great.
All right, and we'll be joined by CS50's own Brian Yu again for that look at assembly. Happy to do what? x86, MIPS.
I spent some time looking at MIPS last year, but maybe.
Tomorrow we'll have multiple other laptops with Google open in front of us.
Yeah. Could it be a mobile application?
It can be anything you want other than a course project, I would say. But small is good, because I think if it's too big of a project, we're only going to scratch the surface and folks might get less out of it. So I think the fewer files, the fewer the lines of code, I think the more instructive it might be. Choose something representative. Library's great, game's great, really anything.
Strongest viewership is right now as we are ending, actually. This is
well, people are excited
ironic.
to be tuning in to see what's next. What show comes on next?
Oh, man. How do we submit? Where do we submit? Atish Sal says, so I'm going to type in the link right here. So bit.ly/CS50 Twitch code review.
Nice.
So you can click on that link, and that will take you to a G form, which you can then plug your Twitch username and your GitHub repo or gist, so that we can pull it up. And make sure it's public, too, because there's some folks that submitted private stuff, and we can't look at that, unfortunately.
Gotcha. Indeed. Well, thank you all for tuning in. We'll be posting this final version of it on Facebook, on YouTube, and all of CS50's channels. So glad everyone tuned in today.
Cool. Yeah, thanks so much, everybody. I guess we'll wrap now, where Wolf Wise says thank you. Thanks so much, everybody who joined us today. I'll see you all tomorrow for some Solitaire. And on Friday, we actually have a Bootstrap one as well with Aaron.
Nice.
So tune in for that one. That'll be a lot of fun. Until then, this was CS50 on Twitch, Code Review Part 2. Enjoy the rest of your evening. We'll see you all tomorrow. Bye. Sorry, here, go ahead, wave again.
Okay, bye for real.